Welcome once again to the INSEAD LeaderCast series. My name is Antonio Fataz and I'm a professor of economics. Now, we're very fortunate to have with us today the chairman of Lloyds Banking Group, Sir Win Bischoff. Now, welcome to INSEAD, Sir Win.
Thank you very much.
So these are interesting times for all of us, for many companies, for many countries. We just went through and we're still going through probably the worst economic crisis we've seen since Second World War, since the Great Depression. Now, the financial sector has been at the center of the crisis, probably has been affected as more than any other sector, and it's also probably either the cause or at least the transmission of the crisis. Now, you've had a great, successful, long career in the financial sector, and my first question is going to be about your perspective. Given that you probably have seen many banking crises before, many financial crises, you've heard people talking about greed in financial markets. Now, how different was this crisis? Did we see something that was so different from the previous ones, or is that just business as usual in this sector?
I think you're right in highlighting that this was probably worse and more deeply felt throughout the financial world. Partly, probably because it was global. I've seen other financial crises. I worked in Hong Kong in the 70s for 12 years. And during that time, there were 2 or 3, but they were very, very local, really in relation to the local banking system. There was a crisis, I think, in '74 in the United Kingdom, and again, it was pretty local. This one is very much more widespread. And even if certain countries weren't actually affected, their banks probably were affected because they have global operations. It's the connectivity which I think has made this a great deal worse. Was it caused? I mean, there's so many causes that one can think of. My view is that ultimately banks have to say to themselves that the buck has to stop somewhere. And whether it's 50 cents of the buck that stops on the desk of bankers, or 40 cents, or 60 cents, or whatever it is, certainly a large part of the buck has to stop there. And I'd like to say one more thing in relation to all of that, and that is, I think politicians in particular, but also the media, have made things worse by equating banks with bankers. Banks are very important transmission mechanisms, they're intermediation institutions and so on. And people find it quite odd that the citizens of countries find it quite odd that while politicians criticize the banks, they've actually poured vast sums of taxpayers' money into it. I think it would be better to criticize the bankers. The banks are inanimate objects. I think if they're run well, they are very, very important for us in our system.
Now, let me go back maybe to talk about the distinction between banks and bankers to some of maybe the most dramatic weeks, which were in the fall of 2008. With the collapse of Lehman Brothers, there was a fear that many of the current financial institutions will be gone by the end of the year. Now, for an outsider, an observer of what was happening, it almost looked like a movie, something unreal with all these characters, these personalities, the discussions. Now, you were in the middle of it. You were the chairman of Citigroup at that point. How did you see it from the inside? Did you ever think of it as a bad dream, something that you never thought it would happen?
Do you know, I think there is a lot is actually said about that Lehman weekend. And I think the common view is now that there was 100% unanimity that if Lehman failed, the system would fail. That wasn't the case. I think there was a choice, and I think a number of us thought that, yes, it would be better if Lehman was saved, but it was more important that Merrill Lynch was saved. That was thought to be the more connected institution. Secondly, we actually also thought that by Merrill Lynch being saved, a fire break was going to be created, and therefore coming out of those meetings on Sunday, I think most of us felt actually, yes, this was a terrible experience, sad, obviously. There was going to be some knock-on effect, but the knock-on effect wasn't going to be anything like that. Well, by Wednesday, of course, the fire had jumped over the fire break and it had attacked Morgan Stanley and Goldman Sachs. So it was actually extremely serious. But it wasn't that weekend. I didn't think we were all as unanimous as it now appears that we may have been.
Were those probably the most intense weeks of your career in the financial sector? Or?
Do you know, actually probably the weekend in November when Citigroup really needed to go to the Treasury and for support, that was worse. But as a bystander, and of course one is a bystander, all of us were asked, you know, can we help? And of course it wasn't possible. You know, JP Morgan had its hands full. Obviously Bank of America was going to help, but then decided to go for Merrill Lynch. Citi couldn't do anything, but Wells Fargo, you know, so there wasn't really anybody around. Barclays did try and help, but that was thought to be not the right thing to do by the British authorities. So there wasn't anybody, and Hank Paulson said he wasn't going to do anything. So it was a very odd sort of, yes, we all wished it could have been a great deal better, but it was not thought to be quite as dramatic in its ultimate result as we thought it would be. Yeah.
Now let me ask you about a couple of trends that we've seen in the last 2 years, and I want to hear your views about whether you think these trends are here to stay or at some point you're going to go back to business as usual. Now one of them is the discussion about whether some financial institutions or even companies which are non-financial institutions are too big to fail. I mean, we've seen in the last 10, 15 years a tendency towards consolidation in certainly the financial industry, both in Citigroup or the Lloyds Banking Group, comes from consolidation of different banks. Now, we talked today about the need to reduce the size of these banks. Do you think this will be happening at some point? We'll go back maybe to smaller institutions and maybe more focused institutions?
You know, our system, of course, tends to either reward or put forward people who like growing things. I think we don't actually reward people who downsize things. I mean, it's just not, it's not what we do. Our system doesn't work that way. And therefore, I think to downsize companies by fiat, by regulatory fiat, I think is going to be quite difficult. I actually think it's much more likely that there is going to be a choice presented, and that is that the larger institutions will have will need to have more capital, even perhaps proportionately more capital, and that the capital markets may in fact be, in the way that it values these institutions, may be saying to managers, actually, Mr. X or Miss Y, CEO of this institution, it is better for your rating to have two companies which are, for your shareholders to own two companies, A and B, which together have a higher value, and you see this in other industries, than to have one which has got a different kind of capital regime. So I don't think it will be actually by force of the regulator saying that you must slim down and reduce size. I think it will come about. It may come about in other ways, capital regimes, liquidity regimes, that sort of thing.
Now you're talking about the role of regulation, the government, and the role of markets. Now another trend that we've seen in the last couple of years is that governments have become more important in the financial sector, but also in the economy in general. Government size is back to the peaks of the 1980s. Is this something that you think first is good? Is it bad? And whether it's good or it's bad, is it here to stay?
Well, it's very difficult, of course, to say that it's bad, because I think we've needed the governments. I mean, if the governments hadn't, in fact, intervened, not just in those banks which have had to have continuing support from the bank, from governments, but also those who, for example, like Goldman's and so on, have actually repaid. But on the day, they needed the money. So I think my own view is that obviously we should try and get to a regime where this is not necessary. Secondly, I am not all that much an opponent of on a short-term basis of government involvement. I've been chairman of, I am chairman of a company which is owned 43% by the UK government. I was chairman, 34% in the US. And governments on the whole don't like to be owners of banks. They really don't. They want to get out. And their economic and financial thinking is very similar to ours. the other shareholders, the management, and so on. Of course, there is an overlay, and a political overlay, and that's where the difference arises. I think governments have a very similar way of looking at the economic and the financial side of things, but then they tend to look over their shoulder at the politics of it, and therefore that makes them sometimes come to all kinds of difficult considerations and conclusion. So, in summary, I think it's not a good thing for a government to be involved. I don't think government wants to be involved. I think whether that's left of centre or right of centre government really wants to be shareholder in a bank. They would like to be able to blame, because if things go wrong, they get blamed. And they don't sit on boards. They don't want to sit on boards. They don't really want to be insiders. So they like to have a slightly distant attitude, but of course they have responsibilities, and that doesn't marry all that easily.
Now let me bring a third trend that we've also seen in the last couple of years as a result of the crisis. Now, the role of emerging markets in the economy. Now, we talked for a long time about globalization, the shift of economic power from developed to developing countries, but at the same time, still the economic world seemed to be dominated by the advanced economies. Now, the current crisis has brought a couple of issues to the agenda. First, from an economic point of view, some of these markets have done extremely well, better than advanced economies. And second, from a political point of view, it seems that we talk much more today about the G20 than we talk about the G7. So it seems that the center, both from an economic and political point of view, is shifting in that direction. Now, is this an inflection point? Is this something which is going to change the way we think about business, the way we think about the financial sector, even over the short term?
I think if there is a definition of the crisis, and an easy definition would be subprime crisis. I think the subprime crisis is an inflection point. I really do. I think it's the first time that there has really been a separation between the developed economies and the emerging markets, or the developing economies. Yes, they've been hit also, but their banking system, funnily enough, has not been as hard hit. Yes, some of their banks have been hit while operating in the United States and so on, but it's really the developed countries' banks that have been hit. South Africa hasn't been hit very hard. Brazilian banks are in good shape. Obviously, Chinese and Indian banks are in reasonable shape. Singaporean and so on. So you can actually. So I think it is an inflection point. I think this is an inflection point. Does it mean that it's irreversible? I'm not. I don't know enough to say that, but it certainly is an inflection point.
I read some comments from you at some point that you said that even if some of the, let's say, financial centers might be moving towards some of these countries, it doesn't mean that the role that the traditional financial centers are going to play is going to go down, because, for example, the UK, London, or some of the other financial centers could help these centers develop. So you think is this an opportunity, and what should companies in advanced economies or financial institutions do to take advantage of this opportunity?
Well, thank you very much for raising that. I was asked by the Chancellor of the Exchequer in June of 2008 to co-chair with him an industry government group to look at the competitiveness of the UK as a financial centre. Of course, we tend to think of London as a financial centre, but it's really the UK. And this was really in response to the Mayor Bloomberg study, Mayor Bloomberg and Senator Charles Schumer study, which was done with the help of McKinsey in New York, looking at New York and its position as a competitive financial centre. What we felt very strongly, what underlay our conclusions, was that partnership is going to be very important in all of this. And by partnership, we actually meant that London should be out there working together with Hong Kong or Singapore, or Dubai was one of the things that we were talking about, possibly Mumbai and others, Shanghai, these places, because they don't have the ability to do all the activities. Yes, they may be able to do some, but for example, the investors still sit very largely in London. And the example that we used, or that I used very often, was Luxembourg. Luxembourg is the centre for collective investment vehicles. The administration has done their fiduciary, lawyers, etc., etc. And on the back of that, Luxembourg has built a fantastic business. but the funds are managed usually out of London, and so there's a symbiosis. You can actually, it's not a zero-sum game. This is not a zero-sum game. One can think, for example, in relation to Islamic finance. Whether Islamic finance is going to be done in Kuala Lumpur or whether it's going to be done in Dubai, it's going to be probably done largely in one of those two places, perhaps one day in Riyadh, who knows. But again, a lot of the activities may actually be carried out in London, but the applicability of what is proper sukuk finance and so on may actually be determined, not in London, but may be determined in Kuala Lumpur or in Dubai. And these kind of things, we came to it, incidentally, and then I'll finish on this particular subject, but we came to it because London has had a tradition of working with other parts of the United Kingdom, whether that's Edinburgh or Glasgow or Bristol or Norwich or whatever it is. Indeed, of those people employed in financial services in the UK, more than half are employed outside London and the South East. So London has always had to do an element of outsourcing, of partnership, and we believe that this is going to be very important for the future. And we believe that way London can maintain its position. We think that the cake will grow. We also think that London's proportion may come down slightly, but of a very much larger cake.
Now let me switch gears a little bit and talk about how financial institutions, banks, are going through some of the difficulties of the current recession. More importantly, when you think about how you manage and how you lead an organization, given that it's a time of crisis, but especially for banks, it has been, as we had discussed before, a time where the public has been looking at banks and have been criticizing banks for bonuses, for high salaries, for their practices, for their bailouts. Now, how do you motivate, how do you engage, how do you retain the employees, the workers, the talent that you have in the bank these days?
I think it's one of the worst things is that banking was actually a profession which people looked up to, and if a young man at the middle level of management would go out to dinner with his wife, and he would be asked, what did he do? What did he do? His job, and he would say, I work in a bank, and this is my position in a bank. Now I can tell you that that level of person would prefer almost to say anything else. Politicians is probably still worse. Journalists are now better, but it's really right at the bottom. And that, I think, has nothing to do with money. That really has, we all like to be working in an industry which is highly regarded. And banking at the moment is not all that highly regarded. Forgetting, of course, that 99.999% of the people who work in banks didn't take decisions which were, caused all this problem. So how do you motivate them? I think basically what you've got to do is to win back the trust in the organization. Once banking organizations are back to have a trust factor of the citizens, and I suspect that may happen if we turn the business around and if governments can actually sell the shares at or near, either at a profit or not at a very large loss. I think that will be helpful. But before that, I think bankers will go through some difficulties. Pay, I don't think is that much of a problem. Banking is still relatively well paid. It may not have been as well paid as it was before, but I think there were excesses there. And again, the vast numbers of people weren't paid way beyond these extraordinary figures that are mentioned. First of all, they weren't paid in the retail banks. They were paid in some of the investment banks, and even in the investment banks, they were paid, to 100 or 150 people right at the top. So for most people, the pay aspect is not that important. The reputational aspect, am I working for a company which is highly regarded in the marketplace, that's a much bigger problem.
In fact, my last question very much relates to the conversation we're having right now. I know you're going to talk later to some of our MBAs, and of course, many of them are thinking about their career when they finish their degree. And as you said, it used to be that one of the top sectors in the list was always banks and financial institutions, and it was very well regarded. And it wasn't so much or only financial rewards, it was more the intellectual, the dynamism, the entrepreneurship that existed in banking that attracted them. Now, what would you tell them today? What are the exciting things that are going to happen in this sector so that they think about this sector as one of the sectors where they should do their career?
Do you know, I think the business models will have to change a bit, and I think there are people who are motivated to be in at the start when things are having to change. I think that the intellectual challenge is very considerable, I think, in banking. I think that's going to be interesting. I think teamwork is probably going to be more important than before, which I think attracts a lot of people. Teamwork was actually always quite important, but I think with some of the star system and so on, it became less important. I think there will be all kinds of challenges. We were talking about smaller banks or bigger banks. For either of those two sides, there will be some interesting judgments that will have to be made. You know, do you work for a very large bank? Do you work? I think boutique banks, particularly on the advisory side, will for a time, I think, be quite attractive because they're not associated with all the transactional side of things. Innovation, on the other hand, will still be hugely important in financial services to deal with the environment, carbon trading, infrastructure spending, the whole area of pension funding and so on. I mean, there are still very, very many interesting intellectual challenges in the banking business. So I would still say this is a fascinating industry to join, and people should give it really some very good thought about joining it. I think it's still very attractive.
I'm sure they will be delighted to hear your advice, and I'm sure many of them will follow that advice and will join this industry.
Thank you very much.
So let me thank you for your time, your insights, and sharing with us all your experiences. It's been a great pleasure and honor to have you here with us today. Thank you.
Thank you.